had a new test for a poorly understood bacteria, right? Recently discovered, only 1990 in HIV patients. And the name of the bacteria is Bartonella. It causes cat scratch disease. So that's the link that was made, and it caused life-threatening complications.
Hi, I'm Terrell Turner, the host of the Business Talk Library, and today I have a special guest on because we're going to talk about something that I think is very interesting. Galaxy Diagnostics is in the space of early stage infectious diseases. So, Amanda, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Amanda, before we start and dive into Galaxy Diagnostics, what was your background before starting this business?
Right. So how did I get into entrepreneurship? Actually, after doing an undergraduate degree in international studies, because I'm really interested in lots of different cultures and the way people think, my first job out of college, my first real job was working in an enterprise software startup in North Carolina. And I worked there for a little over 4 years in HR and then in marketing. And it was just fascinating. I became just amazed at the process of how people come together to build organizations and how companies take new innovations that are really different from the way the system out there works and put it out there and encourage customers to adopt, like what that change process looks like. And it sent me back to grad school. So I ended up in graduate school studying sociology, entrepreneurship, innovation, across countries, across social groups, the processes themselves. And after a good long time and 3 children along the way, I finished my degree, and it was 2008, the Great Recession. Jobs were scarce. So I took an adjunct position at North Carolina State University, where I was introduced to 2 scientists at the vet school. And they were working in this really cool area of emerging infectious disease and had a more advanced test method for documenting infection with a newly discovered pathogen that nobody really knew about. So that was my background and how I ended up getting involved in Galaxy Diagnostics.
And I think that's a very interesting, I guess you say, well-rounded background. I mean, because what was the name of the degree you were getting in graduate school?
So I earned a doctorate in sociology from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Okay, gotcha. And I do find that a lot of times when it comes down to, business and entrepreneurship, I think sociology and psychology is one of those fields that people don't really connect to entrepreneurship and business as much as they probably should.
Oh, I agree. And sociology, of course, is the study of social life, from what's inside our heads to what we do in terms of practices or the actions that we take, to the organizational, the human systems that we build, which are organizations, all sorts of different types of organizations, from families to giant corporations to governments and states. So sociology is really broad. My specific interest was obviously leaning a little bit towards the economic side of it, right? Work and occupations. I was really interested in social stratification as that startup experience. Enterprise software as a female left me with some experiences I wanted to understand better. And and also I'm an immigrant. I pass because I'm Canadian by birth, but I'm an immigrant. And so, of course, you may know a lot of the entrepreneurship that happens in the United States is actually, really led by a high number of immigrants.
And that's one of those things that I find interesting because when I travel, because my wife was born in Kenya, she's half Kenyan, half Nigerian, and she came to the US when she was a teenager. And so when we go back to visit family or we just travel to different countries, it's just the entrepreneurial spirit that is in a lot of those countries we go to. It's always inspiring. And I find that when I come back home to the US and just meeting a lot of different entrepreneurs, a lot of them tell me that same story where they're immigrants or they're descendants of immigrants, and that played a big role in them going down this path of being an entrepreneur, because it's not an easy road to go down, but it is rewarding and exciting when you approach it with the right mindset.
Well, I would say that I've had exactly the same experience. You know, I went to Kenya for the first time a couple of years ago, and some other countries in East Africa, and my travels through Asia. These countries tend to have very young populations. So Kenya, for example, 60% of the population is under the age, of 25. These are very young, vibrant, energetic populations. Kenya's pretty developed compared to some of the other countries in East Africa, but still the way of doing business there is almost always through a small company. I mean, there are some major companies, but it's almost always like foreign interests coming in and setting up factories, or the foreign direct investment, lots of Chinese investment, for example, in Kenya. And so I think that that's part of it, right? As an immigrant, you come into a place where all the system, people do things different ways, all the systems are different. You kind of take what you know, and you use those approaches to creating an economic life, income generation for yourself. I love it because I find that immigrants have a tremendous amount of humility when it comes to figuring out ways to earn money. Whereas in our culture, it's like we train all right from the beginning of school, we sort of train our kids to get a job at a big company. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're really training everybody, like, and the way we educate is very systematic, very routine. It's just follow instructions. Here are your instructions, follow instructions, spit it out on a test. Here are your instructions, follow your instructions, spit it out on a test. It's very routinized. And I think that's why in the world of entrepreneurship, there's a whole thing going on right now about how entrepreneurs have a higher incidence of ADHD, right? ADHD kids, with ADHD, adults with ADHD don't fit. They're like, the square peg in the round hole. They just don't fit. They don't follow the route. Compliance is a little harder for them. They're, very distracted by creative. I don't know that that's true, because I think there are a lot of other people who don't have ADHD and have that same challenge, right? Like, I don't know if these rules are quite the way we should be doing things. Maybe we should be looking at something completely new and different and transforming the way we understand things. So, and that's the innovation aspect. But I do think innovation mindedness is a big part of the entrepreneurial spirit, and what drives a lot of immigrants and Americans to start and grow businesses.
Awesome. Now, speaking of innovation and entrepreneurship, I will say you are the first entrepreneur that is in the infectious disease space that I've had on the show. So I'm very interested in, how did you find that journey of bringing entrepreneurship to a type of business and that type of industry?
Challenging. I honestly, after 10 years of this, I wonder how we get any medical innovation to market. Medicine's a very dogmatic industry, and very resistant to change, heavily bureaucratic. I'm sure you know that there's like a high fatigue level for doctors. It's very hard to be a doctor. Lots of forms, lots of different third-party involvement in the actual doctor-patient relationship, right? Regulatory, professional standards, insurance, all this sort of medical administration. It's really challenging. And and so we were basically going in hoping to influence clinical practice. We had a new test for poorly understood bacteria, right? Recently discovered, only 1990 in HIV patients. And the name of the bacteria is Bartonella. It causes cat scratch disease. So that's the link that was made, and it caused life-threatening complications. So AIDS patients would die from something other than the virus, because their immune system would get compromised. And so it would be other infections, for example, that would take their life. And so this bacteria was discovered as a cause of heart infections, liver infections, these types of things. And so we knew we were in this area of medical discovery. We knew that most physicians out there didn't understand it. We knew that veterinarians understood it better because they care for cats, and cats harbor the bacteria, carry the bacteria at high levels. And we knew we had a more sensitive test that was going to drive medical discovery around the clinical importance of this infection. And so that's what we built the company around and went to market around. And we also were very, like, we had a lot of humility coming into this, right? We were coming from business and veterinary sciences, and we knew that the marketplace for human health was very complicated. And with that in mind, we went in with our learning hats on. Let's listen really carefully to the doctors. Let's on the front line who are trying to deliver individualized care. Let's listen really carefully to the experts who are doing the research and write the guidelines for how doctors should be caring for patients on the front line. Let's listen very carefully to the patients and the disease advocates in this area. Bartonella is a flea-borne infection, can also be transmitted directly with cats, but the symptoms it causes in patients look very much like Lyme disease. And oh, by the way, Bartonella is in the same ticks. So could ticks also be transmitting it? So one of the first lessons that we learned from the physicians was, when a patient comes to me, I don't know what's causing their symptoms, right? I'm trying to figure out what their symptoms are. I'm trying to do some testing to see if I can confirm specific patterns or causes of their symptoms. And I'm trying to rule out, the obvious or rule it in if I can, but I'm trying to figure out, is this really simple? It's kind of like car mechanics, is the fuel pump the problem? Let's change the fuel pump. Oh, that didn't work. What's the next? Because it's almost always a fuel pump, right? What's the next problem? So medicine's fairly rudimentary. They start with probability, what the most obvious thing is, and they work their way down to what is possible. Like if everything else fails, what's possible? And so that's kind of this world we found ourselves in. And so it's like we've got, a better test for a pathogen that's not well understood, that's involved in a problem set that's highly politicized. Because I don't know if you know this about Lyme disease. You're up in the Northeast, most people know, but there are Lyme wars going on, right?
Wow.
The experts disagree with the frontline physicians. And it's not unusual in medicine to find yourself trying to commercialize products in highly contested terrain, right? And a space where experts don't agree, where the practicing physicians don't need the tools or use the tools that the experts are creating for them. And so, yeah, we just found ourselves like right in the middle of this sort of perfect storm of crazy social factors, that made a very difficult climate for commercialization.
So I guess in a situation like that, how do you approach innovation, which, like I said, you have all of these different parties that have a say in it, and then the doctors who are on the front line, which I guess they're as you say, the users of the test, but you have all these other different hands in the situation. So how do you guys usually approach innovation? Is it working directly with the doctors? Is it working with the third parties, or is it just a combination of things?
So I would say it's sort of a combination, and it's a process, and it's not a process you can rush. Change comes slowly. I think it's like with any other social movement, because that's really the way I see the tick-borne disease movement in the United States and around the world. I see it as a social movement. These are people who've come together and said the medical guidelines are not solving the problem. Your models aren't working. Does this sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Right? We're living in this right now. Your models aren't working. Your tests are not working. And this is the crazy thing about COVID and everything we're going through. The FDA coming back and saying we're not going to give EUA to any test that isn't 95% sensitive or better.
Wow.
In Lyme disease world, that this is well known, but the CDC recommended testing approach is 2 serology tests, so antibody tests you use together. And together, they document less than somewhere between 30 to 50% of acute active Lyme disease cases.
Wow.
Can you even imagine? Like, doesn't that just
Wow.
explode your brain? You're like, wow, we're setting these high standards for COVID, but over here, and that's what's contributed to the messiness and the controversy. So you've got physicians out there who have crappy tools and, and high suspicion, like there was a tick attachment, the symptoms presented, it's probably Lyme disease. And then a little company like ours comes into it saying, well, maybe it's not Lyme disease. Maybe it's a different bacteria. There are a lot of different, the guts of those ticks are pretty messy. So from a market perspective, like there's a whole process story around the technology development, right? The problem set there. But from a market development standpoint, we were really a solution looking for a problem, right?
Mhm.
Looking to define a problem. And that is market creation, that is market development. The only way I knew to do that in a way where we could also mainstream the solution, in other words, create a solution and bring it to market and remain credible with our research partners who are the experts writing guidelines and our customers who are the frontline physicians and they don't get along, right? So we're building bridges, we're building communities. We did it, you know, a lot of what we did was bring the science that we did, the high quality science we did, to the physician medical education conferences in this space and say, listen, this is what here are some studies, this is what they said, and this is how we understand that this can help you provide better patient care, right? And then on the other hand, we went back to our, you know, expert partners with what we learned from there and said, we know you think those tests are really good, but you understand the pathogen, you understand the way it performs in the body. Do you understand why these tests aren't good enough, and the patients that they're missing? And it came down to more than tests, right? It was also how the research studies were designed. So had lots of conversations around, you know, how you define the sample in infectious disease. It's challenging because normally with a disease, you define a patient sample based on the cluster of symptoms, and then you run your tests on that to see how good the tests are at confirming the diagnosis. But do you know if you had it right to begin with? Were you missing anybody who had different disease expressions who also could benefit from that diagnostic strategy or therapy or whatever? So research isn't perfect.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was community building. We had early patients. We focused marketplace, community building. It was really about patients starting patient forums. I think we have four different forums running right now. Patients who started patient groups where they can share. We have we didn't start them, but I participate in them to help answer questions and you know, point people towards research or, you know, sound in on different questions that come up. And then we just did social media. Social media was really amazing. It's a complex topic, right, Drell? So
Mhm.
how do you communicate complicated? I mean, you could call it a sales pitch, but it's a complicated sales pitch. Here's a test you only need under certain circumstances, and it's really hard to figure out, you know, how to interpret the results. That depends on all these other factors. So we really relied on social media, and we just did it like one post at a time. And you know, that's really the approach was come along on this journey with us. We're learning from you. We're going to share what we learn from the research. We're going to share what we learned from the physicians. We're going to share what we learned from the patients. And we just did it one post at a time. And it's been hugely successful, right? We have great organic reach. We've got high trust in the relationships that we've really built. And then also, again, to remain credible, we've continued these high quality research partnerships, and we've published as we've gone along, which really differentiates our group from other labs out there, because the standard in lab business is not to show how your new test compares to, you know, every other test unless you're taking it through FDA, right? And we're doing services. So we did it anyway, right? And I would say the norms are moving towards that more and more of that comparative. It's kind of like putting your data out there for people to judge independently. So staying close to the science, sharing what we learned from the boots on the ground, building community. I think that's really what we've done from the beginning.
And now, speaking of that, where can people find you online or on social media to see what's going on in this community?
So our website is www.galaxy, D as in dog, X.com. DX is the abbreviation for diagnostics. So galaxydx.com. We have a blog you can follow where we've got a heavy presence on social media. So Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. And, you know, and for the scientists out there, you know, you can certainly reach out directly. We're happy to talk about how our research interests might work together. And And we have contact@galaxydx.com as our general inbox. People can also reach me pretty easily at, it's just my name, amanda.elam@galaxydx.com. And happy to talk about, what's happening in this space where the technology is concerned, as well as, the clinical practice.
Awesome. Now, for the pet owners, I mean, I guess, are there any immediate concerns or adjustments that pet owners should be thinking about or considering in light of the research that you're finding?
Absolutely. One of our taglines we use in our communications is find it, treat it, prevent it. And prevent it, right? Take care of your animals. Use flea and tick preventatives. I think for people, same thing, right? If you love the outdoors as much as I do, the camping, paddling, trekking, if you're a hunter, if you're a trail runner, if you just like hanging out in your own backyard, it's, use your prevention. You can use permethrin is a great to treat your clothes with, and it can last like 80 washes. If you buy a big jug, it came at Walmart or Target or wherever, online. And so I pre-treat everything. I'm just trying to avoid fleas and ticks. And I didn't really understand how dangerous fleas were before I got into this, because there's been a lot of, I lived in North Carolina. There's a lot of information around Rocky Mountain spotted fever, around Lyme disease, usually more towards the beaches or out in the mountains. But we were warned, ticks transmit disease, be careful. But I never knew, I never really thought about it. Like, the history, right? Bubonic plague, fleas, sure. But today, really? And it's like, yeah, fleas are transmitting plague out west. They're transmitting, they're transmitting Bartonella and rickettsial infections all over the country, all over the world. So those flea infestations, if your cat or dog has fleas, don't sit around. Go ahead and take care of that. It's like, and same with lice, right? When your kid gets lice, it's not just these fleas, lice, ticks are not just a nuisance. They're actually a health threat. So healthy pets, healthy families, right? That's, and the CDC talks about that. You take care of your pet, you're taking care of your family.
Awesome, awesome. Now, one question that I like to ask every guest that comes on, I mean, when you think about the entrepreneurial side of Galaxy Diagnostics, what's the one lesson you've learned in running the business that you think, hey, you know what, other entrepreneurs should definitely learn this lesson to be successful in business?
So I think for running the kind of business that we've been doing, so we're very mission driven, we're very much a social venture, which was to our benefit, because my number one piece of advice is if you've got to create or develop a market, patience. It takes so much longer. I've in my teaching, I've taught my students, that the way businesses are, you start and grow a business is one conversation at a time, which is probably more true for your business than most, Terrell, when it comes to business talks. But it's really true. You build a business one conversation at a time. And so if you have something new, it's going to take a lot of conversations, and you might not be, it's like there could be a long sales process. You might not be closing that sale on the very first conversation. And so I think I would say patience, community building, get out of the office and learn, keep your learning hat on, because if it's new, then your customers aren't the only people who need to learn.
Awesome, awesome. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your wisdom, your insight, and letting us know about, what Galaxy Diagnostics is doing. And I had no idea how complicated the infectious disease research process and getting testing is. I mean, I think most people probably didn't have an idea how complicated that was. And I think all of us, as we're living through, I guess you said, the era of COVID-19, is we're starting to see the effects of like how complicated that process is. So definitely thank you for all that you're doing in that space. And like I said, with the patience and continuing to push through to see the change that needs to happen to protect people.
Well, thank you for giving me an opportunity to share the story. And I agree, we're all drinking from a water hose in COVID-19, and it is definitely like lab medicine 101 for everybody out there. So thank you very much. And I hope everyone stays healthy and happy.
Thanks for tuning in to the Business Talk Library. If you like what you heard and you want to hear more, be sure to click the subscribe button and follow us on all social media platforms as the Business Talk Library.